Hooray! Okay, great. Oh, it does?
Big sigh of relief.
Wow, this is great. This definitely wasn't my fault for just posting these slides about 15 minutes ago. No, not at all. So thank you for having me speak today. I'm doing double duty at this event, as you may have noticed. You've seen me up here a lot today in my role as program committee, but I was asked by the rest of the program committee to also present this final session on collections as data. And that invitation was prompted by my work as a project member on the Always Already Computational Collections as Data team. That project wrapped up formally this May with the publication of our final report and ran officially from 2016 through 2018. So it was one of the great privileges of my professional life to contribute to that work and to serve on this project team. Headed up by Thomas Padilla at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, who's on the live stream. Hey, Thomas. And with co-PI Lori Allen and co-investigators Hannah Frost, Elizabeth Russi-Roque, and Stuart Varner. And I'm pleased today to have the opportunity to speak about the project, and also today to have the opportunity to reflect and share some of my thoughts about how our Collections as Data community project was structured and how it adhered to the idea that Emmanuelle really brought out in her opening keynote around the importance of humanizing the digital and recentering the human in digital humanities. This project was made possible by the generous support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services in the United States. So I've been asked to make this session interactive, which is a little bit of a challenge in the time frame, and I'm cognizant that there's not a lot of time for immersive interactive session, but also whenever I go to conferences, I realize this is a historic moment. This group of people, this group of experience and expertise is never again going to be assembled in this way. So I hope we have some time to take an opportunity around that before we disperse. I'm going to try to be fairly brief in my remarks. I'm going to talk about Always Already Computational, the project, and ideas of community knowledge and ethical representation, and then ask you all to think through and discuss the need for ongoing or new community gatherings, exchanges, and perhaps structures to support ongoing knowledge sharing around collections as data, and how a need for exchange among collection stewards and cultural heritage organizations will change as we move beyond what's really now sort of an initial implementation phase of collections as data that we're seeing. Oh, one more. You know when you read something and you're tempted then in your presentation to just sort of read the whole thing to everyone? You're going to see a bunch of block quotes in this. Sorry about that. But I also wanted to read a quote to start because I recently read Julia Flanders and Fotis Giannidis' The Shape of Data in Digital Humanities. It's an edited volume that came out in 2018. I highly recommend it. And one of the things that they talk about in their opening chapter is the need for our data models to represent not only the history of the artifact itself, but also the history of the ways it has been described and contextualized, as Sarah Ames just talked a little bit about in her lightning talk, talked about briefly in the lightning talk. They write, we need to understand the social, intellectual, and political contexts in which data modeling takes place, the circumstances that shape our data standards, the operation of constraints, systems such as schemas or encoding languages, and the role that ideology and discipline play in our modeling strategies. So those are things that I have foremost in my mind as we'll have this conversation. So I don't expect that you've made it through today's program without hearing a great deal about collections as data. This has come up often, but here's a little bit more to ground the discussion. In early 2016, when the project team for Always Already Computational submitted a grant proposal for funding, we framed collections as data as shown here. A need expressed by researchers, students, journalists, and others to access library and cultural heritage collections, not in page turners or through single item view interfaces, but as data, as a corpus, with full access to texts or images or descriptions that would enable computational analysis. There has been a surge of interest recently in collections as data, coinciding with, or in some cases catalyzed by, our Always Already Computational project. But even in 2016, when we started, there were impressive and inspiring collections as data implementations. We saw a lot of those typically at either really large scale institutions, well-resourced large-scale projects at the level of national libraries like this one, like the KB, the British Library, the BNF, and ambitious museums seeking to make their full collections computationally accessible. And we also, even at that time, saw several smaller pilot studies, in some cases coming out of large institutions, in other cases out of smaller or less well-resourced institutions, that were bringing data together from single collections, maybe posting them to GitHub or making them available by request. And I just wanted to flip through some of the data that was set up just as an example around documenting the American South. Here's the main interface, the way that the project itself, the data modeling behind this project really lent itself then to a collections as data approach. Here's some of the data out of that. Chronicling America, a large-scale American newspaper project coordinated by the Library of Congress, the HathiTrust Research Center, which facilitates computational access to the HathiTrust Digital Library, and posters from the Library of Congress in America sponsored event, which included a collections as data theme in the fall of 2016. So back in 2016, when we were writing this proposal, our project team saw the need for solutions that relied on a community of information professionals that were studying users of collections as data. So as the basis for developing use cases, personas, and functional requirements, and documenting and considering existing and new collections as data implementations. And essentially, we hoped that these would serve as the basis for a very classically librarian thing for recommendations and best practices, a framework for collection owners and collection stewards, and a sort of how do you implement this at your institution. So that was an early goal. This is an excerpt from our grant proposal in terms of what that project aimed to do. So we embarked on an ambitious program. We had planned to host one national forum, which would be an invitation and self-nominated gathering of participants for focused several days discussion of collections as data. But our participants were all very economical when they booked their flights, so we were actually able to host a second national forum. We had enough funding for that. The project team presented at least 17 conferences. You may have attended some of these presentations over that period. And we also launched a listserv for exchange. We built a Zotero library. We did a number of gathering activities. And this is an early incomplete list, but really we were blown away by the response and the interest that we heard back from people. These are just some of the institutional affiliations of people who contributed to our framework. And this is a fuller, though not entirely complete, list of contributors. These are people who either authored pieces of our framework, edited project resources, participated directly in those days-long national forums, worked on program committees for some of our smaller events. We hosted a pre-conference at Digital Humanities in Montreal in 2017. And there were many others beyond this list who contributed, and we are immensely grateful to everyone who made this effort possible. It really would not have been, yeah, we would have been dead in the water. What can I say? This is an amazing, generous list of contributors here. So the major output of the project was a set of deliverables that comprise a collections as data framework. Some of these resources are documentary in nature, so they're describing implementations in detail. And others, such as the position statements and the Santa Barbara statement on collections as data, are statements that make explicit arguments about key questions, issues, and considerations prompted by collections as data. So these include some of our position statements. These were written by every participant in our first forum was asked to write a position statement. I'm just showing a couple of excerpts from those. So memory institutions already work at this data at scale, but what's hidden by interfaces, some of the questions that came up through this. Tim Sherritt commenting on the way that collections as data positions the researcher to contribute back to the library, another theme that we heard today. The Santa Barbara statement on collections as data, which was written by the project team after our first forum in an attempt to capture themes and threads from that event, and really to recenter some of the values that were emerging around collections as data. Was then distributed and workshopped openly. So here's a view of a comment on the draft that had been posted openly online, and we solicited feedback, which led then to the publication of a second, more complete version. Personas, which also relied on data gathered at the first forum to provide tools for those designing collections as data. We also produced 15 facets or case studies. These were written and contributed by authors from a range of institutions, so not written by the program committee, written directly by those implementing collections as data, and they document those implementations. Authors of the facet were asked to respond to a series of prompts, so these all include sort of a formula where the authors talk about why they embarked on collections as data, how they made the case within their organization, how they did it, shared any documentation that they produced over the course of the project, commented on who the users were for these data sets, commented on how use was supported by the institution and the organization that was hosting, and other things people should know. And Zach can talk to you about his facet here. And finally, methods profiles contributed by teams of authors, which explain some of the types of uses of collections as data. So some of the feedback that we were getting was that institutions could read these facets and understand some of the why, but they weren't quite sure what was going to happen with this data. They didn't know what sort of techniques, what sort of tools were going to be applied. And the methods are an attempt to really bring out and try to gather and synthesize what happens to the data after it's released into the world. 50 things that you can do to work towards collections as data implementation. So these are a set of recommendations, again, developed by the project team, but based on responses gathered over the course of the project, and especially in the second forum where we had targeted discussions about steps that you can take within your organization to move towards collections as data readiness. And finally, in our final report, analysis and findings, which are described in greater detail, and all these resources are gathered together in a voluminous set. So together, these resources document extant experience and share lessons learned from those who have implemented collections as data, suggesting paths into the work. They also assert a great deal and bring out a great deal of difference in the particulars of implementation, clustered around the common ground that is mapped out by the Santa Barbara Statement. So there are particular things about the timing of this work that I'd like to highlight now that we've made it through the many, many resources that comprise the collections as data framework. So as we wrote in the Santa Barbara Statement, 2017 was an opportune time to foster these exchanges between cultural heritage stewards, whether based in libraries, museums, or other cultural heritage organizations with different roles and staffing models. It was a good time to bring out the particulars of implementation, because at that point we had high-profile examples of collections as data that had been running smoothly and were seeing a lot of use. And we also had examples of very well-resourced, very elegant collections as data implementations that weren't really working, weren't doing what the institution had hoped. So collections as data implementers were starting to assess their work, starting to think through some of the usefulness after the initial burst of activity, and refining their own practices, making adjustments, similar to some of the process that we probably saw when digital collections first went online. Going also through a process of reassurance that a digital collection was not going to displace the library, that they were going to make the collections more useful. So it was an opportune moment to embark on a community discussion around collections as data. And this gets back to the title of my talk, which is Community Before Computing. And I was reflecting on this project and the way that we designed it as a community project, really seeking a lot of input from anyone who is implementing or considering implementing collections as data. And I was wondering, is it fair for me to say, with some reflection on this project, that this focus on community and exchange needed to take precedence over technical solutions, such as functional requirements for common library and museum publishing platforms? Initially, we thought we just will get a group together and we'll have functional requirements. They will be formed by this group. But it turned out there was a lot more that needed to be done in terms of establishing an area of collections as data, setting forth value statements, documenting existing practice before we could move into the realm of common solution. I think this expectation and this trajectory is all but foretold in the classic John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid 2001 article, which foretells so much, Knowledge in Organizations, a Social Practice Perspective. In this article, Brown and Duguid emphasize the social nature of learning new practices. They argue that distinct practices make the communities, and so identities and knowledge within the communities distinct. And they observe that members of a community of practice are simultaneously members of a larger dispersed occupational group, such as library collections data specialists, and also members of a community within an organization, such as a library. So communities of practice are able then to mediate between individuals and large formal and informal social structures, and between organizations and the larger environment, allowing work to be done in knowledge creation and organizational learning. One of the goals of the Always Already Computational project in inviting this documentation and the exchange and reflection among those currently practicing collections as data and those considering implementations was to establish a network of practice and begin to move towards formalizing an epistemic culture of collections as data. And in so doing, to make explicit, this is back to the values-driven approach that I talked a little bit about with the Santa Barbara statement, to make explicit the centrality of ethical questions about representation, description, labor, and automation that is suggested in the transformation, publication, and maintenance of born digital or digitized materials into and as computational data. So it is a moment of change and transformation that should prompt us to reassess existing practices and think about moving towards a more ethical framework of digital collections. These ethical questions are inherited from several of the overlapping areas that really constitute and influence collections as data, including histories and traditions of collecting and describing materials, emergent data practices, especially inside and outside of the digital humanities, and the transformation of humanities materials into data, which is necessarily has to be a purposeful and sensitive process. As Chris Allen Sula sums up, critics both inside and outside of the digital humanities have noted a range of ways in which data tends to encode, reinscribe, perpetuate, amplify, and even favor existing power structures, or at the very least, that data is limited in its radical potential for dismantling those structures. These criticisms extend beyond the databases themselves and include related processes of analysis and visualization. So there's so much to talk about that won't fit into this talk. There's so much to talk about. I'm just going to give you a list of things that I would love to talk to you about. We could talk about projects that have built upon collections as data that have been made available by cultural heritage organizations to do deep text or image analysis, or to create exhibits out of the massive library collections data. Projects that have exemplified ethical approaches or sought to recenter communities and their representation. Examples of collections as data implementations that have answered Bethany Novisky's clarion call to build towards speculative collections. We could talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence as applied to collections as data. We could talk about some of the themes that are really built into the next stage of collections as data, the Part to Whole project around organizational challenges in supporting and sustaining a collections as data approach that builds upon and upends existing digital collection work, the specific roles of archival theory and post-custodial approaches, digital archives and web archives, a huge, huge area. We could talk about collections of sensitive or restricted materials and the potential for mediated access, how repositories in our existing technical infrastructure can really serve this work or be extended to serve this work. We can talk about institutional or steward concerns. I think some of these are predicted in some of Christine Borgman's work on disciplinary data curation and data sharing practices in terms of organizations or stewards being reluctant to release data that isn't finished or complete, some of the protectiveness around data. We could talk about one of my favorite areas, which is the realization that collection stewards are dedicated consumers of their own collections as data. This was something that came up throughout as a theme. And the way that projects to release collections as data have ended up really removing barriers to access within the organization. So the people who were having trouble getting this collections data are not just our researchers and our journalists and our teachers and our startups that are trying to get access to this collections data, but often people within the library who never had that sort of level of access, and how publication of collections as data can really serve those working within the organization. That was a really fascinating finding from this whole project, and one that we heard throughout. Oh, and another, we can talk about the significance of our emphasis on collections as data within the context of projects, the way that we often are scoping things to projects, sometimes pilot projects, but sometimes ongoing, never-ending, non-pilot projects, versus what we think of as these fully scaled implementations where we attempt to make all data available. And some of the interplay between the heterogeneity and the specificity of particular collections and particular community needs associated with those collections, as coming into contact with libraries' tendency to seek regularity and promote adherence to standards and predictability, and to really operate on collections as data at scale. These are all things I would love to talk about, and maybe we can talk about them. I'd really like to hear from you. So I want to just leave us with a final argument, and then we're going to have some time. How much time?
20 minutes.
Oh, this is great. Okay. I cut so many things out. Look, now we have time to talk to each other. I'd like to hear from you. So I'm going to leave you with a final argument, and then we'll talk about how we're going to talk to each other. Collections as data is underway, but much work remains to be done to further define, delineate, and grow a community of practice and a knowledge culture around this work, which will in turn potentially move to resolve significant outstanding questions about preservation and versioning. This is a big issue. We're creating these data sets. How are we versioning them? How are we preserving them? How are we managing this living data? Discoverability, how are people finding these data sets? How are they interacting with the other data sets released by other institutions? As well as broader considerations around ethical representation. The implementation challenges for collections as data are social and technical, communal and place-specific, they're multidimensional, and they're entwined. Cultural heritage organizations have a significant role to play here as research partners, back to our main theme, who document and refine an approach to collections as data that blends expertise in data modeling, curation, and management, serves disparate stakeholders and users, and authentically represents collections in context. So my question to you is how we as information professionals gathered here at this unique moment in history, in this day together, what can we think of, how can we work together and work with our communities of stakeholders towards this goal, towards collections as data implementation that is ethical, that serves our users, and that is maintainable, sustainable. So I think I'm going to ask you to talk to your neighbors about this.